In the heart of Lancaster County's rolling farmland, where tradition runs deeper than the furrows in ancient fields, young Samuel Yoder made a discovery that would change everything. Walking the old mill road at dawn, he found something that shouldn't have been there. A skeletal donkey chained to a rotting wagon, left to die in the shadows of neglect. While most would have walked away, calling it someone else's problem, Samuel saw something different. He saw a creature that deserved compassion, regardless of convenience or cost. What started as a simple act of mercy would ripple through his tight-knit Amish community in ways no one could predict. Some would call him foolish for taking on such a burden. Others would question whether kindness has limits. But Samuel's choice would test everything his community believed about sacrifice, faith, and what it truly means to love thy neighbor. What Samuel didn't know was how this one decision would divide his entire community. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wooden cross hanging above Samuel Yoder's bed had been carved by his grandfather's weathered hands 43 years ago, each groove and curve worn smooth by decades of faithful fingers tracing its edges during morning prayers. At 28, Samuel had inherited more than just his grandfather's skill with wood and chisel. He carried the old man's quiet strength, his measured way of speaking, and his tendency to see God's hand in the smallest details of daily life. Samuel's bedroom window faced east, where the first light of dawn painted the rolling hills of Lancaster County in shades of gold and amber. From his bed he could see the neat rows of his mother's vegetable garden, the red barn where his carpentry workshop occupied the back corner, and beyond that, the patchwork of farms that stretched to the horizon like a quilt sewn by generations of faithful hands. His mother, Hannah Yoder, had been a widow for 8 years now, since Samuel's father passed from a sudden heart attack while mending fence on a crisp October morning. She was 54, with silver threading through her brown hair beneath her white prayer covering, and hands that still moved with the sure grace of a woman who had spent 3 decades keeping house, raising children, and tending to the countless small tasks that made an Amish home run like clockwork. Samuel was her only child still at home. His older brother, David, had married young and moved to a farm near Strasbourg. His sister, Rebecca, lived in Ohio with her husband and 4 children. That left Samuel and Hannah to manage the old homestead, a responsibility Samuel carried without complaint, but sometimes with a quiet longing for something more. The Yoder farm sat on 60 acres of some of the finest soil in Pennsylvania, passed down through 4 generations of faithful stewardship. Samuel's great-grandfather had cleared the original 20 acres with nothing but an axe, a mule, and an unshakable belief that God rewards those who work with their hands. Over the decades, the family had added more land, built new barns, and established themselves as reliable neighbors and devoted members of their church district. Samuel's carpentry business operated from the converted corner of the barn, where the scent of fresh pine shavings and linseed oil created an atmosphere of purposeful creation. His reputation for fine craftsmanship extended beyond the Amish community into the surrounding English towns, where customers valued the honest workmanship and attention to detail that seemed increasingly rare in the modern world. The rhythm of Samuel's days followed patterns as old as the faith itself. Before dawn, he would milk their 3 Jersey cows, feed the chickens, and check on the handful of sheep they kept for wool. After breakfast with Hannah, he would spend the morning hours in his workshop crafting furniture, cabinets, or whatever commissioned pieces filled his order book. Afternoons were for farm work, tending their small tobacco crop, maintaining buildings, or helping neighbors with whatever tasks required an extra pair of strong hands. Evenings belonged to family time, when Hannah would mend or quilt, while Samuel read from the German Bible or the Martyr's Mirror, their voices joining in the ancient prayers and hymns that connected them to centuries of faithful ancestors. Sometimes neighbors would visit, and the kitchen would fill with quiet conversation about crops, weather, or news from distant relatives. Samuel's position in the community was that of a respected young man who had proven his reliability and devotion, though some of the elders occasionally wondered when he would choose a wife and start his own family. Several suitable young women in the district had made their interest known, but Samuel had never felt the spark of connection that his parents had shared, the kind of love that made ordinary days feel blessed and meaningful. He was known for his thoughtful nature, his willingness to help anyone in need, and his habit of taking long walks along the back roads when he needed to think through problems or pray without distraction. These solitary walks had become Samuel's way of processing the weight of responsibility he carried, not just for his mother and their farm, but for living up to the expectations of a community that valued conformity, tradition, and the wisdom of collective decision-making. The old mill road was one of Samuel's favorite walking routes, a narrow lane that wound through abandoned fields and past the ruins of a gristmill that had served the area generations ago. Few people traveled that way anymore, which made it perfect for the kind of quiet reflection that helped Samuel sort through his thoughts and find the clarity that came from communion with creation itself. The morning mist still clung to the valleys when Samuel stepped onto the old mill road, his boots finding the familiar rhythm that had carried him along this path countless times before. The air held that particular coolness that comes just before sunrise, when the world seems to hold its breath in anticipation of another day's beginning. He had walked perhaps a quarter-mile when something unusual caught his eye near the bend where the road curved past the old Kellerman property. At first he thought it might be a fallen tree or an abandoned piece of farm equipment, but as he drew closer, the shape resolved into something that made his steps slow and his heart quicken with concern. A wagon sat tilted at an odd angle beside the road, its wooden wheels partially sunk into the soft earth at the field's edge. But it was what stood beside the wagon that stopped Samuel in his tracks and sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the morning air. Chained to the wagon's side was a donkey, and the sight of the animal struck Samuel like a physical blow. The creature was little more than a skeleton wrapped in dull, matted grey hide. Its ribs showed clearly beneath its coat, and its hip bones jutted out sharp and prominent. The donkey's head hung low, almost touching the ground, and even from a distance Samuel could see the way it stood, with its weight shifted, favoring one leg as if standing had become a burden almost too great to bear. The chain that held the animal was thick and heavy, wrapped around a spoke of the wagon wheel and secured with a rusty padlock. The donkey had perhaps 3 feet of chain to move with, just enough to reach a small patch of weedy grass that had long since been cropped down to bare earth. There was no water bucket, no feed trough, no shelter from the elements that this poor creature had clearly endured for far too long. Samuel approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs as he took in the full extent of the animal's suffering. The donkey's ears twitched at his footsteps, and slowly, with what seemed like enormous effort, the creature lifted its head to look at him. What Samuel saw in those dark, liquid eyes nearly brought him to his knees. There was no wildness there, no fear or aggressions, just a deep, weary resignation that spoke of weeks or perhaps months of abandonment and neglect. The donkey's eyes held an intelligence and gentleness that made Samuel's throat tighten with emotion. This was not an animal that had been born wild and fierce. This was a creature that had once known kindness, had once trusted human hands to provide care and comfort. Samuel reached out slowly, letting the donkey catch his scent before gently touching the animal's neck. The fur was coarse and dirty, but beneath it Samuel could feel the rapid flutter of a heartbeat and the trembling that spoke of weakness and hunger. The donkey did not pull away from his touch. Instead, it seemed to lean slightly into his hand, as if even that small gesture of kindness was more than it had received in longer than it could remember. Looking around the abandoned wagon, Samuel could see evidence of how long this travesty had been going on. The grass within the donkey's reach had been eaten down to dirt, and even the weeds beyond its chain had been stretched for and consumed as far as the animal could manage. An old bucket lay overturned nearby, bone dry and filled with dead leaves. Samuel's jaw tightened as he examined the chain more closely. Whoever had done this had meant for the donkey to die here, slowly and alone. The chain was secured with a heavy padlock that showed no signs of rust, suggesting it had not been here as long as the animal's condition suggested. Someone had been coming by occasionally, perhaps to check if their problem had resolved itself through starvation and neglect. The practical part of Samuel's mind told him this was not his responsibility. The donkey belonged to someone else, and getting involved would mean taking on a burden he was not prepared for. His mother would worry about the expense of veterinary care. The community would question his judgment in taking on such an obvious liability. There were proper channels for reporting animal abuse, authorities who were trained to handle such situations. But as Samuel looked into those weary, trusting eyes, all the practical considerations seemed to fade into background noise. This was not about ownership or responsibility or community approval. This was about a suffering creature that had been abandoned to die, and Samuel knew with absolute certainty that he could not walk away. Samuel ran his hands along his tool belt until his fingers found the small hacksaw he always carried for emergency repairs. The blade was sharp and well maintained, but cutting through the heavy chain would take time and considerable effort. The donkey watched him with those patient, trusting eyes as Samuel began working on the links closest to the animal's neck, where a frayed piece of rope served as a makeshift halter. The weathered halter had once been good leather. Samuel could see that, hand-stitched with careful attention to detail, it bore the marks of quality craftsmanship that someone had once taken pride in. But time and neglect had cracked the leather, and the brass fittings had turned green with age. Still, it was the only proper piece of equipment the donkey wore, a reminder that this animal had once been valued and cared for. 20 minutes of steady sawing finally parted the chain with a sharp snap that seemed to echo in the morning stillness. The donkey lifted its head slightly, as if understanding that something fundamental had changed, though it made no immediate move to step away from where it had been imprisoned for so long. Samuel coiled the remaining chain and examined the padlock more closely. It was newer than he had first thought, and bore the stamp of a hardware store in Lancaster. Someone local had done this, someone who had access to proper restraints and had deliberately chosen to abandon this animal to a slow death. Leading the donkey proved easier than Samuel had expected. The animal followed him with surprising willingness, though its steps were slow and careful, each hoof placement deliberate and considered. Samuel kept his pace gentle, stopping frequently to let the donkey rest and catch its breath. What should have been a 15-minute walk home stretched to nearly an hour. Hannah was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she saw her son approaching with his unexpected companion. Samuel watched his mother's expression shift from surprise to concern, to the resigned acceptance that came from 30 years of dealing with her husband's and now her son's tendency to bring home wounded creatures. She walked over to meet them, her hands still damp from the washwater, and stood quietly studying the donkey with the practical eye of a woman who had helped birth and raise countless farm animals over the decades. "Samuel," she said finally, her voice carrying that particular tone mothers use when they are trying to be supportive, while also expressing serious reservations. "This poor creature is in terrible condition. Are you certain you know what you're taking on?" Samuel led the donkey into the shade of the big oak tree beside the barn, and helped it settle onto the soft grass. "I found him chained to an old wagon on the mill road, Mama. Someone left him there to die. I couldn't just walk away." Hannah knelt beside the donkey and ran her experienced hands over its ribs and flanks, her touch gentle but thorough. "He's severely malnourished, probably dehydrated, and look at these hooves. They haven't been trimmed in months, maybe longer. This is going to require serious veterinary attention, and that means Dr. Matthews." Dr. James Matthews was the English veterinarian who served most of the farms in their area. A kind man in his 60s who had been treating Amish livestock for over 30 years. He understood their ways and charged fair prices for honest work. But even fair prices could add up quickly when dealing with an animal in this condition. Samuel nodded, understanding the implication. "I'll call him from the phone shanty. This donkey deserves a chance, whatever it costs." While Samuel walked to the community phone to contact Dr. Matthews, Hannah fetched a bucket of fresh water and set it where the donkey could reach it easily. The animal drank slowly but steadily, as if afraid the water might disappear if consumed too quickly. Dr. Matthews arrived within 2 hours, his truck loaded with the medical supplies that had become as familiar as furniture to farming families throughout Lancaster County. He was a tall, thin man, with gentle hands and patient eyes, the kind of veterinarian who took as much pride in healing a poor farmer's sick cow as he did in treating expensive show horses. His examination was thorough and methodical. He checked the donkey's heart rate, breathing, temperature, and carefully inspected every inch of the animal's body for injuries or signs of disease. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and looked up at Samuel with an expression that mixed professional concern with genuine compassion. "This animal has been systematically starved," Dr. Matthews said, his voice carrying the quiet anger of a man who had seen too much unnecessary suffering. "Probably over a period of several months. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Bishop Eli Miller's walking stick announced his arrival long before his black buggy appeared in the Yoder's driveway. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of the carved hickory against the porch steps was a sound that commanded respect and attention throughout their church district. At 72, the bishop moved with the measured deliberation of a man who had spent 5 decades shepherding his flock through the challenges of maintaining their faith in an increasingly complex world. Samuel was in the barn, gently brushing the donkey's coat with soft strokes, when he heard his mother's voice calling him to the house. The animal he had decided to call Hope had shown remarkable improvement in just 3 days of proper care. Matthew's medication regimen was working, and the steady diet of hay, grain, and fresh water was beginning to restore some life to those gentle dark eyes. The bishop sat in Hannah's kitchen, his broad-brimmed hat resting on the table beside a cup of coffee that steamed in the afternoon light. His presence filled the room with an authority that came not from force or intimidation, but from the quiet strength of a man who had earned his position through decades of wise counsel and faithful service. Samuel Bishop Miller said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent making difficult decisions for the good of the community. "I've been hearing talk about this animal you've taken in." Samuel took the chair across from the bishop, very aware of his mother's worried glances as she busied herself at the stove. The walking stick leaned against the table between them, its carved handle worn smooth by countless hands and hours of contemplation. "Yes, I found him abandoned and near death. I couldn't leave him there to suffer." Bishop Miller nodded slowly, his weathered fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "Your compassion does you credit, Samuel, but I'm concerned about what this decision might represent. There are those in our community who worry that you're taking on burdens that aren't rightfully yours." The bishop's words were gentle but carried an unmistakable message. In their tightly knit community, individual choices reflected on everyone, and actions that seemed to prioritize personal desires over collective wisdom could create divisions that threatened the harmony they all depended on. "Deacon Stoltzfus stopped by yesterday," the bishop continued. "He mentioned that you've been spending considerable time and money on this animal, money that might be better used for your mother's care or your own future preparation for marriage and family." Samuel felt heat rise in his cheeks, but kept his voice respectful. "The donkey was dying, Bishop Miller. Surely our faith calls us to show mercy to all of God's creatures." "Indeed it does," the bishop agreed, "but it also calls us to wisdom in how we show that mercy. There are proper channels for reporting animal abuse. There are authorities trained to handle such situations. By taking this burden entirely upon yourself, you may be acting from pride rather than genuine compassion." The accusation of pride struck Samuel like a physical blow. In their community, pride was considered the root of many sins, the force that led individuals to place their own judgment above the collective wisdom of the church. It was a serious charge, one that could have lasting consequences for his standing in the community. Hannah set a plate of fresh-baked cookies on the table, her hands trembling slightly, Samuel could see the strain this conversation was putting on his mother, caught between supporting her son and respecting the authority of their spiritual leader. "I understand your concerns," Samuel said carefully, "but I've seen what neglect and abandonment do to God's creatures. This donkey had given up hope when I found him. He was ready to die. How could I walk away from that suffering?" Bishop Miller studied Samuel with eyes that had seen decades of human struggle and triumph. "The question isn't whether you should have helped, Samuel. The question is whether your continued attachment to this animal is becoming more important to you than your obligations to your family and community." The bishop picked up his walking stick and rose slowly from his chair. "I'm not ordering you to abandon this donkey, but I am asking you to consider whether your charity has become a form of stubbornness. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to recognize when we've done all we reasonably can and trust God to handle the rest." Samuel walked the bishop to his buggy, the walking stick tapping steadily across the porch and down the steps. As the black carriage pulled away, Samuel could see neighbors watching from their own porches and windows. Word would spread quickly about the bishop's visit, and everyone would want to know what had been discussed and decided. The wooden feed bucket had taken Samuel 3 evenings to complete, each piece carefully shaped and fitted with the same attention to detail he brought to his finest furniture. Made from seasoned oak with hand-forged iron bands, it was built to last generations, though Samuel never spoke aloud his hope that hope might live long enough to justify such craftsmanship. Each morning now began with the ritual of filling the bucket with the carefully measured portions Matthews had prescribed. 2 cups of sweet feed, a handful of rolled oats, and chopped apples when Samuel could manage them. Hope had learned to recognize the sound of Samuel's footsteps approaching with breakfast, and would lift his head with something that almost resembled eagerness. The transformation was remarkable to witness. In 2 weeks, the sharp edges of Hope's ribs had begun to soften under a thin layer of healthy flesh. His coat, while still patchy and rough, showed hints of the silver gray it had once been. Most encouraging of all, Hope had begun to show interest in his surroundings, watching the chickens with curious eyes and turning his head to follow the sounds of farm life around him. Samuel had established a routine that revolved around Hope's needs. Morning feeding was followed by gentle grooming, using soft to work through the tangles in the donkey's coat while checking for any signs of injury or illness. Matthews had shown him how to examine hooves for stones or infection, how to monitor the animal's breathing and heart rate, and how to recognize the subtle signs that might indicate a setback in recovery. Afternoons brought a different kind of care. Samuel would lead Hope around the paddock behind the barn, short walks at first, but gradually extending as the donkey's strength returned. Hope moved with careful deliberation, but there was a growing steadiness in his gait that spoke of muscles remembering their purpose and bones carrying weight without pain. The evening routine had become Samuel's favorite part of each day. After the farm chores were finished and supper was cleared away, he would sit on an old stump beside Hope's paddock and simply talk about his work, about the weather, about the small dramas and concerns that filled his day. Hope would stand nearby, close enough that Samuel could reach out and scratch behind the donkey's ears and listen with the kind of patient attention that Samuel had never experienced from another living creature. Hannah had initially watched these conversations with the worried expression of a mother whose son might be losing touch with reality. But gradually she began to see something in Samuel that had been missing for years, a sense of purpose, a gentleness in his manner, and a quiet contentment that had replaced the restless searching she had noticed in her son since his father's death. The changes weren't lost on the community either. When Samuel drove to the hardware store for supplies, conversations would pause and eyes would follow his progress through the aisles. At church services, he could feel the weight of glances and whispered discussions that ended abruptly when he approached. Some of the attention was supportive. Mary Byler, whose husband had died the previous winter, stopped by one afternoon with a bag of carrots from her garden. "For your donkey," she said simply, but her eyes carried a message of understanding. She too knew what it meant to care for something fragile, and vulnerable. Young Jacob Stoltzfus, despite his father's vocal criticism of Samuel's choices, had taken to stopping by on his way home from school. The 10-year-old would climb onto the paddock fence and watch Hope with fascination, asking endless questions about donkeys and their care. Samuel found himself looking forward to these visits, enjoying the boy's innocent curiosity and the way Hope seemed to sense the child's gentle nature. But there were other reactions as well. Samuel noticed that certain community members had begun to avoid him, their greetings shorter and less warm than before. Orders for furniture had slowed, though Samuel couldn't be certain whether this was due to seasonal patterns or community disapproval. The isolation might have bothered him more, if not for the profound satisfaction he found in Hope's continued recovery. Each day brought small victories. The first time Hope approached the fence when Samuel called. The morning he found the donkey standing with his head up, alert and interested rather than hanging in defeat. The evening Hope gently nuzzled Samuel's shoulder while being brushed. These moments of connection filled something in Samuel's heart that he hadn't even realized was empty. In caring for Hope, he had discovered a capacity for tenderness and patience that surprised him. The donkey's quiet trust had awakened in Samuel a protectiveness that felt both natural and profound. Sarah Brenneman stepped down from her cousin's buggy with the careful grace of someone who had spent 3 weeks tending to a bedridden relative in Ohio. Her black traveling dress was wrinkled from the long journey, and exhaustion showed in the way she paused to steady herself before reaching for her small suitcase. At 26, Sarah carried herself with the quiet confidence of an unmarried woman who had found purpose in caring for others, though the community whispers suggested her time for marriage was growing short. She had been walking toward her family's farmhouse when she heard it, a sound that stopped her dead in the road and sent her heart hammering against her ribs with recognition and disbelief. The distinctive bray of a donkey, but not just any donkey. This was a voice she had known since childhood, one that had called to her across pastures and welcomed her home from school for 15 years. Without conscious thought, Sarah dropped her suitcase and followed the sound toward the Yoder property. Her feet moved faster with each step, drawn by a possibility that seemed too wonderful and terrible to believe. As she rounded the corner of the Yoder barn, she saw him standing in the paddock, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Jeremiah," she whispered, the name falling from her lips like a prayer. The donkey lifted his head at the sound of her voice, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, they simply looked at each other across the fence. Then Jeremiah took 2 careful steps toward her, and Sarah's composure crumbled completely. Samuel emerged from the barn at that moment, carrying the evening feed, and stopped short at the sight of a young woman clinging to his paddock fence, with tears streaming down her face. He had seen Sarah Brenneman at church services and community gatherings, of course, but they had never spoken beyond polite greetings. Now she stood in his barnyard, weeping over his donkey as if her heart was breaking. "Miss Brenneman," he said softly, setting down the feed bucket. "Are you all right?" Sarah turned to face him, her cheeks flushed with emotion and her prayer covering slightly askew. In her hands, she clutched a small, faded photograph that she held out toward Samuel with trembling fingers. "This is my father," she said, her voice thick with tears. "With his donkey, Jeremiah. I've been looking for him for 6 months." Samuel took the photograph carefully, studying the image of a bearded man standing beside a young donkey in front of a barn that looked remarkably similar to his own. The man's hand rested gently on the donkey's neck, and both seemed to be looking directly at the camera with expressions of quiet contentment. "Your father?" Samuel asked, though the family resemblance was clear in Sarah's eyes and the set of her jaw. "Daniel Brenneman. He died last winter from pneumonia. When he got sick, my uncle Amos said he would care for Jeremiah until I could figure out what to do. But when I got back from nursing Aunt Martha in Ohio, Amos claimed the donkey had wandered off, said there was nothing to be done about it." Sarah's voice hardened with an anger that seemed foreign to her gentle nature. But I knew Amos never cared for animals the way Papa did. Jeremiah wouldn't have just wandered off. He was the most loyal, gentle creature. Papa raised him from a colt, trained him with patience and kindness. They were inseparable. Samuel looked from the photograph to the donkey, pieces of a painful puzzle falling into place. "You think your uncle—" I think Amos saw Jeremiah as nothing but a burden and a reminder of debts he didn't want to honor. Papa left the donkey to me in his will, but Amos was the executor. He had legal control over everything until the estate was settled. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she continued, "I've been to 3 counties looking for him, posted notices, asked at every farm and livestock auction. I was starting to think—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Samuel understood. "Where did you find him?" Sarah asked, reaching through the fence to stroke Jeremiah's neck with the familiarity of long affection. Samuel told her about discovering the donkey chained to the abandoned wagon, about the condition Jeremiah had been in, about Dr. Matthews' assessment and the long weeks of careful nursing that had brought the animal back from the edge of death. With each detail, Sarah's face grew paler and her anger deeper. When Samuel finished, she stood in silence for several minutes, her hand never leaving Jeremiah's neck as the donkey pressed close to the fence, clearly recognizing and treasuring her touch. The unfinished letter lay hidden beneath the loose board in Samuel's workshop, written on paper that still smelled faintly of sawdust and linseed oil. He had started it 3 times, each attempt beginning with "Dear Sarah," and ending with crumpled pages thrown into the fire. The words he needed seemed to exist somewhere beyond his reach, in a place where feelings could be captured in mere letters and delivered without the risk of complete humiliation. For 2 weeks now, Sarah had been coming by every evening after her chores were finished, spending quiet hours in the paddock with Jeremiah. Samuel found himself timing his own evening routine to coincide with her visit, manufacturing reasons to work near the barn, while she brushed the donkey's coat and whispered stories of her father in a voice too soft for Samuel to hear the words, but clear enough for him to recognize the love in her tone. Hannah had noticed, of course. Mothers always noticed when their sons began paying unusual attention to their appearance. When evening chores that once took an hour suddenly required 2. When a young man who had never shown particular interest in conversation suddenly found endless topics to discuss while leaning against paddock fences. "She's a good woman," Hannah had said one evening as she and Samuel washed the supper dishes together. "Sarah Brenneman has always been known for her kindness and her devotion to family. It's no wonder Jeremiah responds as well to her care." Samuel had only nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he tried to respond. How could he explain the way his heart sped up when he heard Sarah's soft laughter drifting from the paddock? How could he describe the contentment that settled over him when he watched her gentle hands working through Jeremiah's coat, or the way her presence seemed to make the ordinary farm evening feel touched with something approaching magic? The complications were overwhelming. Sarah was older than most unmarried women in their community, which meant she had likely declined previous suitors for reasons of her own. She came from a respected family, though her father's death had left her in reduced circumstances that might make marriage negotiations complicated. And then there was the matter of Jeremiah himself, the living reminder that Samuel's care of the donkey had been temporary from the beginning. Dr. Matthews had declared Jeremiah fully recovered during his last visit, pronouncing the donkey healthy enough to return to normal work and activity. The veterinarian had shaken Samuel's hand with genuine admiration, praising his dedication and skill in nursing the animal back to health. But the doctor's good news felt like a countdown to Samuel, marking the approaching end of his reason for spending time with both Jeremiah and Sarah. Sarah never spoke directly about taking Jeremiah home, but Samuel could see her making mental calculations as she assessed the donkey's recovery. She lived alone now in her father's small house, with just enough land for a garden and perhaps a few chickens. Caring for a donkey would require arrangements for pasture, feed, and shelter that might be beyond her current means. Samuel had found himself thinking about solutions. He could offer to board Jeremiah permanently, charging nothing for the privilege of continuing to care for an animal he had grown to love. He could propose partnership arrangements that would give Sarah access to her donkey while allowing Samuel to maintain the relationship that had become so central to his daily happiness. But every potential solution felt like a presumption, an assumption that Sarah would welcome his continued involvement in her life and her decisions. They were still virtually strangers, after all, connected only by their shared affection for a donkey and the polite conversations they managed during her evening visits. The letter hidden beneath the floorboard was his attempt to bridge that gap, to find words that might express his growing feelings without overstepping boundaries or making demands. But every time he tried to write, the words seemed either too forward or too casual, too presumptuous or too distant. Last evening had been the worst and best yet. Sarah had stayed until well after dark, helping Samuel with the evening feeding and talking about her father's methods for training donkeys with patience rather than force. In the lamplight from the barn, her face had been soft with memory and affection, and Samuel had found himself studying the curve of her cheek, the way her hands moved with such gentle confidence, the sound of her voice speaking about things that mattered to her. When she had finally gathered her shawl to leave, their hands had brushed as she handed him Jeremiah's lead rope, and the contact had sent electricity through Samuel's entire body. The petition paper arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Deacon Stoltzfus, with the solemnity of a man carrying official church business. The document was written in the careful script of someone accustomed to formal correspondence, and bore 7 signatures from the church elders, each name penned with the weight of collective concern. Samuel read it standing on his front porch while Hannah peered over his shoulder, her sharp intake of breath telling him she understood the implications as clearly as he did. The language was formal but unmistakable. The undersigned church members respectfully requested that Samuel Yoder reconsider his excessive attachment to worldly concerns and return his focus to the spiritual and community obligations that should guide a faithful man's priorities. The petition didn't mention Jeremiah by name, but the meaning was clear to anyone familiar with the situation. Samuel's devotion to the donkey, and by extension his growing relationship with Sarah, was being viewed as a dangerous drift toward individualism and worldly attachment that threatened the community's spiritual harmony. Deacon Stoltzfus stood quietly while Samuel finished reading, his own discomfort evident in the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot. At 62, the deacon was known for his fairness and his reluctance to involve himself in controversies that might be resolved through private conversation. The fact that he had been chosen to deliver this petition spoke to how seriously the church leadership was taking the situation. "Samuel," the deacon said finally, his voice heavy with regret, "you know this brings me no pleasure. But there are members of our community who believe your recent actions show a concerning disregard for proper submission to church authority and collective wisdom." Samuel folded the petition carefully, his hands steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "And what would you have me do, Deacon Stoltzfus? Leave a suffering animal to die? Ignore my Christian duty to show mercy?" "No one questions your compassion," the deacon replied. "But compassion without wisdom can become pride, and pride leads to separation from the community that sustains us all. The bishop spoke with you weeks ago about finding balance. These signatures represent men who fear you haven't heeded that counsel." Hannah stepped forward, her voice carrying the protective edge of a mother defending her child. "Samuel has done nothing but show Christian charity to a creature in need. Since when is kindness considered worldly attachment?" Deacon Stoltzfus looked uncomfortable, but pressed on. "The concern isn't about kindness, Hannah. It's about the extent to which that kindness has become Samuel's primary focus, possibly at the expense of his obligations to family, community, and his own spiritual development." After the deacon left, Samuel walked to the paddock, where Jeremiah stood in the morning shade, Sarah already there for her daily visit. She looked up as he approached, and he could see she had heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. "They want you to give him up," she said quietly, her hand resting on Jeremiah's neck. Samuel leaned against the fence, the petition still in his hand. They want me to remember my place in the community, to put collective wisdom ahead of individual judgment. Sarah was silent for several minutes, her fingers working through Jeremiah's mane with the automatic motion of long practice. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Maybe they're right. Samuel felt as if she had struck him physically. Sarah, no, listen to me. Her voice grew stronger, though he could see tears gathering in her eyes. Look what my stubbornness has already cost. You've spent weeks and considerable money nursing Jeremiah back to health. You've faced criticism and pressure from your church leaders. Your business has suffered, and now your standing in the community is being questioned. She turned to face him directly, and Samuel could see the pain this was causing her. I've been selfish, Samuel. I've been so grateful to have Jeremiah back, so happy to see him healthy and content, that I haven't considered what my daily visits might be doing to your reputation. I don't care about my reputation, Samuel said fiercely. But I do, Sarah replied. And you should too. Your mother depends on you. Your community has invested decades in your spiritual development. Your future depends on maintaining good standing with the church leaders. The petition crumpled slightly in Samuel's grip. Are you telling me to choose between Jeremiah and my community? Sarah's tears spilled over then, tracking down her cheeks as she struggled to maintain her composure. I'm telling you that sometimes love means making hard choices. Sometimes it means letting go of what we want most in order to protect what matters most. The broken plow handle lay in two pieces on Samuel's workbench, the hickory wood split cleanly along a grain line that had probably been weakened for months without his notice. It was the third tool to fail him in as many days, coming at the worst possible time when the Peterson family had commissioned a dining set that needed to be completed by month's end. Samuel stared at the broken handle with frustration that went far beyond a simple equipment failure. The tool had belonged to his father, part of a set of hand planes and chisels that represented 3 generations of Yoder craftsmanship. Now it lay ruined, a victim of the distraction and carelessness that seemed to be creeping into every aspect of his work. His order book, once filled months in advance, had handled to just 2 outstanding commissions. Word traveled quickly in their close-knit community, and potential customers were clearly having second thoughts about hiring a carpenter whose judgment and priorities were being questioned by the church leadership. The Peterson dining set might be his last significant order for some time. Hannah's illness had started as a persistent cough that she dismissed as nothing more than a seasonal irritation. But 3 days ago, the cough had worsened into something that left her breathless and weak, forcing her to spend most of her time resting in her bedroom, while Samuel tried to manage both the household duties and his failing business. Dr. Morrison, the English physician who served their area, had diagnosed stress-related exhaustion complicated by a respiratory infection. He had been diplomatically careful not to specify what might be causing Hannah's stress, but his meaningful glances toward the paddock where Jeremiah grazed suggested he was well aware of the controversy surrounding the Yoder household. The medical bills were mounting alongside the veterinary expenses Samuel had already incurred. Dr. Matthews had been generous in allowing extended payment terms for Jeremiah's treatment, but Dr. Morrison expected cash payment for his services. Samuel's savings account, built carefully over years of steady carpentry income, was dwindling at an alarming rate. Sarah's visits had become less frequent as the community pressure intensified. When she did come, their conversations were strained and careful, both of them aware that every moment they spent together was being observed and discussed by neighbors whose approval could make or break Samuel's future in the community. Yesterday had brought the most devastating blow of all. Martha Stoltzfus, the district's unofficial matchmaker, had approached Sarah with a proposal from John Byler, a widower from the next township whose wife had died in childbirth 2 years earlier. John was financially stable, well-respected, and in need of a wife to help raise his 3 young children. Sarah had told Samuel about the proposal during one of their brief, awkward conversations by the paddock fence. She hadn't accepted immediately, she assured him, but neither had she declined. The offer represented security, respectability, and an escape from the controversy that was threatening to engulf them both. Samuel's nights had become exercises in sleepless torment, lying in bed, listening to his mother's labored breathing through the thin walls, while wrestling with decisions that seemed to have no good outcomes. Every choice appeared to require sacrificing something precious: his relationship with Jeremiah, his growing love for Sarah, his mother's health and peace of mind, or his standing in the only community he had ever known. The broken plow handle seemed to mock his predicament. Tools like relationships and reputations required constant care and attention. Neglect them too long, place too much stress on weakened intents, and they would fail when you needed them most. Samuel picked up the pieces and examined the break more closely. The wood was still sound except for the split itself. With careful work, glue, and perhaps a metal reinforcement, the handle might be repaired to function again. It wouldn't be as strong as the original, and the repair would always be visible, but it might serve its purpose for years to come. As he contemplated the repair, Samuel became aware that Hannah was calling his name from the house. Her voice carried a note of urgency that sent him running across the barnyard, the broken handle forgotten on the workbench. He found his mother sitting on the edge of her bed, still in her nightgown despite the afternoon hour, her face pale and her breathing shallow. In her hands she clutched a letter that bore the formal seal of the Lancaster County clerk's office. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "we have a problem." Hannah's wedding ring caught the lamplight as she turned it slowly around her finger, a gesture Samuel had seen countless times during his childhood, whenever his mother needed to gather courage for difficult conversations. The simple gold band had grown loose over the years, sliding easily around her thin finger as she spoke about love and sacrifice, in a voice weakened by illness, but strengthened by decades of hard-won wisdom. "Your father gave me this ring on a morning very much like this one," she said, her eyes focused on something beyond the bedroom window. "We had been courting for 2 years, but his family disapproved of the match. They thought he could do better than a farmer's daughter with no dowry and questionable prospects." Samuel sat beside his mother's bed, holding the county letter that had arrived that afternoon. It was a formal notice regarding property tax assessments, nothing urgent or threatening, but Hannah's weakened state had made even routine correspondence seem ominous and overwhelming. "What did Papa do?" Samuel asked, though he had heard versions of this story throughout his childhood. Hannah smiled, her fingers still working the wedding ring. "He chose love over approval. He chose the future he wanted rather than the one others expected him to want. But Samuel, you must understand, he didn't make that choice lightly or selfishly. He spent months in prayer, seeking guidance. He spoke with his own mother, with our bishop, with anyone whose wisdom he trusted." She paused to catch her breath, the respiratory infection making even casual conversation an effort. "In the end, he realized that sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is trust your own heart when it has been shaped by years of trying to follow God's will." Samuel set the letter aside and took his mother's hand, feeling how fragile her fingers had become during her illness. "Mama, I don't know what to do anymore. Every choice feels wrong somehow." "Tell me about Sarah," Hannah said softly. The request surprised Samuel. His mother had been carefully neutral about his growing attachment to Sarah, neither encouraging nor discouraging, but watching with the patient observation of someone who understood that matters of the heart required delicate handling. "I think I love her," Samuel admitted, the words feeling both liberating and terrifying to speak aloud. "But how can I be sure? We've known each other such a short time, and all our conversations have been about Jeremiah or the controversy surrounding him. I don't know if what I feel is real love or just the bond of shared concern for an animal we both care about." Hannah nodded thoughtfully. "Love often begins with shared purpose. Your father and I fell in love while caring for his sick mother. We discovered each other's character through how we handled difficulty and responsibility together. She struggled to sit up straighter, and Samuel adjusted her pillows to help her find a more comfortable position. What matters isn't how long you've known someone, or under what circumstances you met. What matters is whether you can imagine building a life together, whether you bring out the best in each other, whether your love makes both of you more faithful and more generous. But the community pressure, Mama, the bishop's concerns. My business is failing, your health is suffering, and everyone seems to think I've lost my way. Hannah's grip on his hand tightened with surprising strength. Samuel, there's something I need to tell you. Something your father made me promise to share when you were ready to make your own choices about love and marriage. She reached into a bedside table and withdrew a small wooden box that Samuel recognized, but had never seen open. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper, was a second wedding ring, identical to the one his mother wore. This was meant to be passed down to your wife, Hannah said, but your father wanted you to know the story behind it. He had to work for 3 months as a hired hand on English farms to earn the money for these rings, because his own family wouldn't support the engagement they disapproved of. Samuel stared at the ring, understanding for the first time the depth of sacrifice his parents' love had required. He gave up his family's approval. Temporarily, yes, but Samuel, here's the important part. His family came around eventually. Love that is genuine and faithful has a way of proving itself over time. People who truly care about you will learn to support choices that make you a better person, even if those choices initially make them uncomfortable. Hannah closed the ring box and placed it in Samuel's hands. I'm not telling you what to choose, son, but I am telling you that choosing love over approval, when that love is genuine and faithful, is sometimes the most courageous and faithful thing a person can do. The hand-braided lead rope Samuel had spent 3 evenings creating lay coiled in his workshop, each strand of hemp carefully selected and woven with the same attention to detail he brought to his finest furniture. The rope was strong enough to last a lifetime, soft enough not to chafe tender skin, and long enough to give Jeremiah freedom to graze while still maintaining control. It was meant to be Samuel's final gift to the donkey, a tangible expression of love made manifest through the letting go. Sarah arrived at sunset, as she had every evening for the past month, but tonight Samuel could see she carried the weight of decision in her shoulders and the careful set of her mouth. They had both known this moment was coming, had felt it approaching like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. Jeremiah stood in the paddock, healthy and alert, his coat gleaming silver-gray in the fading light. Matthews had pronounced him fully recovered during his last visit, declaring the donkey ready for whatever work or companionship his future might hold. The transformation was so complete it seemed miraculous, this vibrant animal bearing no resemblance to the broken creature Samuel had found chained to an abandoned wagon. I've made arrangements with the Millers, Sarah said quietly, her hands resting on the paddock fence. They have pasture to spare, and Mrs. Miller has always been fond of donkeys. They'll board Jeremiah for a reasonable fee, and he'll be close enough that I can visit daily. Samuel nodded, understanding the practical wisdom of the arrangement while feeling something break apart in his chest. The Millers lived 3 miles away, far enough to remove the daily reminder of his attachment to Jeremiah, close enough for Sarah to maintain her relationship with her father's beloved companion. That sounds like a good solution, he managed, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. Sarah turned to face him directly, and Samuel could see she had been crying, though she held her composure now with the determination of someone who had wrestled with angels and emerged scarred but victorious. Samuel, I need you to know that these weeks have been precious to me. Watching you care for Jeremiah, seeing the gentleness and patience you brought to his healing, learning to know your heart through your actions. I will treasure these memories regardless of what happens next. She was saying goodbye, Samuel realized, not just to the daily visits, but to whatever fragile possibility had been growing between them during these stolen evenings by the paddock. The community pressure is too much, he said, not making it a question. For both of us, Sarah agreed. My reputation matters less than yours, perhaps, but it still matters. And Samuel, I won't be the cause of division between you and your church, between you and your mother's peace of mind. Samuel picked up the braided lead rope, testing its strength one final time before offering it to Sarah. I made this for him, for your father's Jeremiah, not my hope. I want you to have it. Sarah accepted the rope with hands that trembled slightly, running her fingers along the careful braiding. It's beautiful work, like everything you create. I need you to understand something, Samuel said, the words coming from some deep place he hadn't known existed. Caring for Jeremiah these past months, it changed me, not because he's special or magical, but because loving something that needed love, putting another creature's welfare ahead of my own comfort, it taught me what I'm capable of, what kind of man I want to be. Tears spilled over Sarah's cheeks then, though she made no sound of crying. You're already that man, Samuel. You've been that man since the morning you found him dying and chose to care. They stood together in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the western sky. Jeremiah moved closer to the fence, sensing perhaps that something significant was happening, that the patterns of his days were about to change again. Samuel reached through the fence to scratch behind the donkey's ears one last time, memorizing the soft texture of the fur, the warmth of the animal's skin, the way Jeremiah leaned into his touch with complete trust. Goodbye, Hope, he whispered. Sarah opened the paddock gate and clipped the new lead rope to Jeremiah's halter. The donkey followed her willingly, though he kept looking back toward Samuel with what seemed like confusion and concern. Samuel stood at his fence and watched them disappear into the gathering darkness. Sarah's white prayer covering visible long after her dark dress had been swallowed by the night. The wooden carving sat on Samuel's nightstand, a perfect miniature of Jeremiah captured in basswood, with every detail lovingly rendered during the sleepless nights that followed the donkey's departure. Samuel had worked on it by lamplight, his hands finding familiar comfort in the rhythm of knife against wood, while his mind struggled to process the emptiness that seemed to have settled into every corner of his life. 3 days had passed since Sarah led Jeremiah away, and Samuel had tried to return to normal routines. Morning chores felt hollow without the ritual of preparing the donkey's feed. Evening hours stretched endlessly without the peaceful companionship of sitting by the paddock, sharing the day's events with an audience that never judged or questioned. Hannah's health had begun to improve almost immediately after the tension in their household eased. She was eating better, sleeping more soundly, and had even ventured out to tend her vegetable garden yesterday morning. The doctor's visit confirmed what Samuel already suspected. His mother's illness had been as much about stress and worry as any respiratory infection. Samuel was replacing a broken fence board when he heard the commotion from the road. Voices calling, the sound of running footsteps, and beneath it all, a familiar braying that sent his heart hammering against his ribs with recognition and disbelief. He dropped his hammer and ran toward the sound, rounding the corner of the barn just in time to see Jeremiah trotting up their driveway with the determined gait of an animal who knew exactly where he belonged. The braided lead rope Samuel had made hung loose around the donkey's neck, dragging in the dust where it had apparently been broken or chewed through. Behind Jeremiah came a small parade of neighbors who had witnessed the donkey's escape and tried unsuccessfully to redirect him back toward the Miller farm. Young Jacob Stoltzfus ran alongside, laughing with delight at the spectacle, while his father followed more slowly, shaking his head with what looked like reluctant admiration. Sarah appeared last, having run most of the 3 miles from the Miller farm, her face flushed with exertion and her prayer covering askew. She carried the broken end of the lead rope in her hand, evidence of Jeremiah's determined escape from his new accommodation. The donkey ignored everyone else and walked directly to Samuel, pressing his soft nose against Samuel's chest in a greeting that spoke of joy, relief, and absolute certainty about where he wanted to be. Samuel wrapped his arms around Jeremiah's neck, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and sunshine that seemed to carry with it all the contentment and purpose that had been missing from his life. He broke through 2 fences, Sarah said, her voice carrying a mixture of exasperation and wonder. Chewed through the lead rope, pushed past the Miller's draft horses, and headed straight here like he had a map. Mrs. Miller said she's never seen anything like it. Deacon Stoltzfus approached the group, his expression thoughtful as he studied the reunion taking place in front of him. "This donkey seems to have strong opinions about where he belongs," he observed. "Animals know," said Mary Byler, who had been hanging laundry when Jeremiah passed her farm. "They know when they're loved properly, and they know where their hearts belong. You can't argue with that kind of loyalty." Samuel looked up from Jeremiah's neck to find a small crowd of neighbors gathered in his barnyard, all of them watching the reunion with expressions ranging from amusement to something approaching awe. These were practical people who understood the behavior of livestock, but there was something in Jeremiah's return that seemed to transcend ordinary animal instinct. "What will you do now?" asked Jacob Stoltzfus, his young voice carrying the curiosity of someone too innocent to understand the complexities that adults created for themselves. Samuel met Sarah's eyes across Jeremiah's back, seeing his own confusion and hope reflected in her face. The donkey had made his choice with unmistakable clarity, but that didn't resolve the human complications that had led to his departure in the first place. "I suppose," said Deacon Stoltzfus slowly, "that when God's creatures make their will known so clearly, faithful people ought to pay attention." The crowd began to disperse as the immediate drama resolved itself, neighbors returning to their interrupted chores with a story that would be retold for years to come. But several people lingered, and Samuel noticed that their expressions had changed from disapproval to something approaching respect. Jeremiah had chosen, and in choosing, had somehow transformed the situation from a controversy about stubborn attachment to a demonstration of the kind of loyalty and devotion that their faith held as virtues. The engagement quilt had been started by Hannah during the first weeks of her recovery, when her hands needed gentle work to rebuild their strength, and her heart needed a project that spoke of hope rather than worry. The pattern was traditional, the wedding ring design that had blessed marriages in their community for generations, but Hannah had chosen colors that seemed to glow with unusual warmth: deep blue for faithfulness, cream for purity, and soft gold for the prosperity that comes from love freely given. Word of the quilt's purpose spread through the community with the speed of all significant news, and soon other women were arriving at the Yoder kitchen with fabric scraps, thimbles, and the kind of advice that flows as naturally as conversation when women gather to work with their hands. Sarah had been the first to join Hannah at the quilting frame, her stitches small and precise, her presence in the Yoder household no longer a source of controversy, but a cause for quiet celebration. The proposal had come 3 days after Jeremiah's dramatic return, delivered by Samuel with the kind of nervous formality that made Hannah hide her smile behind her coffee cup. "Miss Brenneman," Samuel had said, standing in their kitchen with his hat in his hands and his courage gathered like armor, "I would be honored if you would consider becoming my wife." Sarah had looked at him for a long moment, her eyes bright with tears that this time spoke of joy rather than sorrow. "Samuel Yoder, I thought you would never ask." The engagement had been announced at Sunday service by Bishop Miller, who spoke with the kind of measured approval that suggested the church leadership had reconsidered their earlier concerns. The bishop's words were carefully chosen, emphasizing the importance of faithful love and the wisdom of recognizing God's hand in bringing suitable companions together. Miss Stoltzfus had been the first to congratulate them after service, her earlier criticism apparently forgotten in the face of a romance that had captured the community's imagination. Even her husband, the deacon who had delivered the petition of concern, shook Samuel's hand with genuine warmth and offered the use of his largest field for the wedding reception. "It seems," Bishop Miller had said privately to Samuel after the announcement, "that your donkey has taught us all something about loyalty and faithfulness. Perhaps our concerns were misplaced." The quilting circles became planning sessions as the women worked their way around the wedding ring pattern. Martha Byler volunteered to coordinate the wedding meal, while Ruth Stoltzfus took charge of organizing the cleaning and preparation of the church building. Young Jacob Stoltzfus, who had become something of a hero among the children for his early support of Samuel's choices, appointed himself official guardian of Jeremiah's wedding day behavior. Hannah's stitches grew stronger and more confident as the quilt progressed, her health improving with each day that brought evidence of her son's happiness. The respiratory infection had cleared completely, and she moved through her daily tasks with an energy that hadn't been seen since before Daniel's death years earlier. "I never doubted you would find your way," she told Samuel one evening as they worked together on the final border of the quilt, "but I confess I worried about the cost of that finding. Love shouldn't require choosing between happiness and community, between following your heart and honoring your faith." Sarah looked up from her careful stitching, her needle paused in mid-motion. Perhaps that's what Jeremiah was trying to show us all. That real love doesn't divide or separate. It draws everything together, makes everything stronger. Matthews had stopped by the previous afternoon, ostensibly to check on Jeremiah's continued health, but really to congratulate Samuel on his engagement and to express his admiration for the way the situation had resolved itself. The veterinarian had seen many cases of animal neglect and abandonment over the years, but few that had ended with such a complete restoration of both creature and community. "That donkey of yours has accomplished something remarkable," he had told Samuel. "He's reminded a whole community what faithfulness looks like in practice." The quilt was nearly finished now, its interlocking rings a testament to the work of many hands united in common purpose. Each stitch represented hours of conversation, shared wisdom, and the kind of fellowship that turned individual effort into collective blessing. Samuel ran his fingers along the completed sections, marveling at the intricate beauty that had emerged from what began as simple fabric scraps and thread. Like his relationship with Sarah, like his bond with Jeremiah, like the community's gradual acceptance of choices that had initially seemed troubling, the quilt had become something greater than the sum of its parts. The wedding certificate bore the simple elegance that marked all official Amish documents, written in careful script on heavy paper that would endure for generations. Bishop Miller's signature anchored the bottom of the page, flanked by the witnesses who had gathered in the Yoder farmhouse on a crisp October morning when the maples blazed red and gold against an impossibly blue sky. Samuel stood beside Sarah in his mother's front room, surrounded by faces that reflected the warmth and acceptance that had gradually replaced the earlier controversy. His new wife wore the traditional blue dress that would serve as her best dress for years to come, her prayer covering freshly starched and her face glowing with a happiness that seemed to illuminate everyone around her. The ceremony itself had been brief and deeply meaningful, focused on the sacred promises being made rather than elaborate ritual or display. Bishop Miller had spoken about the nature of faithful love, about the way true marriage creates something stronger than either individual could achieve alone, and about the importance of building their union on the foundation of shared faith and mutual service. Hannah had wept quietly throughout the service, her tears a mixture of joy for her son's happiness and gratitude for the way their community had rallied around what had once seemed like an impossible situation. She wore her own wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit her smaller frame, a visible link between generations of faithful love. The reception that followed filled the Stoltzfus field with long tables, abundant food, and the kind of celebration that marked significant moments in their community's life. Children ran between the tables while adults lingered at coffee and wedding cake, sharing stories and offering advice with the comfortable familiarity of people who had known each other for decades. Jeremiah had been given a place of honor at the celebration, decorated with ribbons and stationed where he could observe the festivities while remaining safely away from the food tables. Young Jacob Stoltzfus had appointed himself the donkey's official attendant, ensuring he had fresh water and the occasional treat while regaling anyone who would listen with the story of how Jeremiah's loyalty had brought Samuel and Sarah together. Matthews had arrived in his truck loaded with a wedding gift that surprised everyone, a new harness for Jeremiah, crafted by the area's finest leather worker and designed to last for decades of gentle work around the farm. Every faithful creature deserves proper equipment, he had explained, his twinkling with affection for the donkey who had become something of a local celebrity. Deacon Stoltzfus had offered a toast that acknowledged the lessons learned through the events of the past month. Sometimes, he said, raising his glass of fresh apple cider, God teaches us about faithfulness through the most unexpected messengers. This donkey has shown us that love, when it is genuine and selfless, has the power to heal divisions and bring communities together. As evening approached and the celebration began to wind down, Samuel and Sarah found themselves standing beside Jeremiah's paddock, watching their wedding guests help with the cleanup that would restore the Stoltzfus field to its working condition. The sense of community support was overwhelming, evidence of how completely their love story had been embraced by people who had once questioned its wisdom. "Do you think he knows?" Sarah asked, scratching behind Jeremiah's ears as the donkey leaned contentedly against the fence. "Do you think he understands what his loyalty accomplished?" Samuel considered the question seriously, studying the donkey's peaceful expression and remembering all the moments that had led them to this day. "I think he knows he's loved. I think he knows he's home. Maybe that's all any of us really need to understand." Hannah approached them carrying the wedding certificate, her face radiant with contentment. "This needs to go in the family Bible," she said, presenting the document to Samuel and Sarah. "Right beside your father's and mine, and his parents before that." The certificate felt substantial in Samuel's hands, its formal language unable to capture the full story of how this marriage had come to be. The document spoke of Samuel Yoder and Sarah Brenneman joining their lives in holy matrimony, but it couldn't record the chain that had bound a dying donkey, the weeks of patient nursing that had restored hope to a broken creature, or the way that simple act of compassion had blossomed into a love that transformed an entire community's understanding of faithfulness. As the last guests departed and the October stars emerged in the darkening sky, Samuel and Sarah stood together beside their home, their hands joined and their future stretching ahead like an unwritten story full of promise and possibility. The month that followed brought a rhythm to their lives that felt as natural as breathing. Samuel and Sarah had settled into their shared home with the easy compatibility of two people who had discovered they complemented each other in ways that went far beyond their mutual love for Jeremiah. Sarah's gentle organization brought order to corners of the household that had been neglected during Hannah's illness, while Samuel's steady craftsmanship created improvements and conveniences that made daily life flow more smoothly. Hannah had moved into the smaller bedroom that had once been Samuel's, giving the young couple the master bedroom while maintaining her place as the household's elder. The arrangement worked beautifully, with 3 generations of wisdom and experience creating a home that felt both stable and vibrant. Samuel's carpentry business had rebounded with surprising speed once the community controversy settled. Orders began arriving again, first from neighbors who wanted to show their support, then from English customers who had heard the story of the Amish carpenter whose love for a donkey had won him a wife. Dr. Matthews had proven to be an excellent source of referrals, telling the story to his veterinary clients who appreciated the craftsmanship that went into Samuel's work. Jeremiah had assumed the role of farm mascot, with the dignity of someone who understood his own importance in the family's story. Children from neighboring farms would stop by on their way to and from school, hoping for a chance to pet the famous donkey and hear Sarah retell the story of his rescue and recovery. Samuel had built a special viewing area beside the paddock, complete with benches where visitors could sit comfortably while admiring Jeremiah's gentle demeanor. The donkey had also proven useful in ways Samuel hadn't anticipated. His calm temperament made him perfect for teaching young children how to interact safely with large animals. Several neighbors had asked Samuel to bring Jeremiah to their farms when introducing their own children to livestock, knowing that the donkey's patient nature would make the experience positive and educational. Sarah had established a small garden behind the house, expanding on Hannah's traditional vegetables with herbs and flowers that attracted beneficial insects and provided natural remedies for minor ailments. Jeremiah had appointed himself guardian of this garden, standing watch from his paddock and alerting the household to any wildlife that might threaten the carefully tended plants. The community had embraced their unconventional love story with an enthusiasm that surprised even Samuel. Young couples would sometimes ask for permission to visit Jeremiah, believing that seeing the donkey who had brought Samuel and Sarah together might bless their own romances. Bishop Miller had initially been skeptical of what he called superstitious thinking, but gradually came to see these visits as opportunities for young people to reflect on the nature of faithful love and commitment. Matthews continued his regular visits, now coming as much for the pleasure of seeing Jeremiah thriving as for any medical necessity. The veterinarian had become something of a family friend, often staying for dinner and sharing stories of other animals whose recoveries had required similar dedication and patience. These visits always reinforced Samuel's sense of gratitude for the choice he had made that morning on the mill road. Sarah had begun teaching basic animal care to the community's children during their Sunday afternoon gatherings, using Jeremiah as a gentle instructor who tolerated small hands and curious questions with remarkable patience. These lessons covered everything from proper feeding techniques to recognizing signs of illness or injury, but they always included discussions about the responsibility that came with caring for vulnerable creatures. Samuel watched these teaching sessions from his workshop window, marveling at how naturally Sarah had assumed the role of educator and advocate. Her father's love for animals lived on through her, expressed now in a way that benefited the entire community's understanding of compassionate stewardship. The seasons turned with their natural rhythm, each bringing its own joys and challenges. Spring meant new grass for Jeremiah and the excitement of planning expanded gardens. Summer brought long evenings when the whole family would sit on the front porch, watching Jeremiah graze in the fading light while discussing the day's events and planning for tomorrow's work. Fall was Samuel's favorite season, when the Pennsylvania countryside blazed with color, and the year's harvest brought a sense of completion and gratitude that seemed to settle into his bones like contentment made manifest. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of deep cold that settles into bones and stays there until spring's first warmth drives it out. Samuel had spent weeks preparing for the season, insulating Jeremiah's shelter with extra straw, checking and repairing fences that would need to withstand harsh weather, and stockpiling the feed that would carry their animals through the months when pasture grass lay buried under snow. The first real storm of the season brought 18 inches of snow and winds that howled around the farmhouse, with a voice that seemed to speak of endurance and patience. Samuel woke before dawn to the sound of that wind and knew immediately that this would be a day for staying close to home, for checking on animals and making sure everyone had what they needed to weather the storm. Jeremiah stood in his shelter, completely unbothered by the weather that had transformed their familiar landscape into something foreign and beautiful. His thick winter coat had grown in full and dense, and he seemed to take a particular pleasure in the way the snow crunched under his hooves when Samuel led him out for his morning constitutional. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as Samuel and Jeremiah made their way through the deep snow, two figures moving with the careful deliberation of those who understood that winter demanded respect and attention. She had coffee brewing and breakfast warming on the stove, creating the kind of welcoming atmosphere that made even the harshest weather feel manageable. Hannah had taken to spending her winter mornings in the front room, where the largest window provided the best light for her needlework and the best view of the barnyard activities that marked each day's rhythm. Her health remained strong, and she had discovered a new sense of purpose in documenting the family's story through carefully stitched samplers that would preserve their history for future generations. The storm lasted 3 days, during which the small household settled into the kind of enforced togetherness that either strengthens families or reveals their weaknesses. In the Yoder house, it proved to be a time of deepened intimacy and shared content. Samuel worked on small carpentry projects in his corner of the kitchen. Sarah organized and mended household linens, and Hannah told stories of previous winters that had tested their family's resilience and faith. Jeremiah became something of a barometer for the weather's severity. When the wind was merely strong, he would venture out into his paddock and stand with his back to the gusts, patient and stoic. But when the storm reached its most fierce intensity, he would retreat to his shelter and wait, demonstrating the kind of wisdom that comes from accepting what cannot be changed while maintaining readiness for better conditions. On the fourth morning, Samuel woke to silence. The wind had died during the night, and sunshine streamed through the bedroom window with the particular brilliance that comes after significant snowfall. He dressed quickly and made his way to the barn, eager to assess any damage and begin the work of digging out from the storm's effect. What he found in the barnyard took his breath away. The snow had drifted in patterns that created natural sculptures, and the familiar buildings and fences had been transformed into something that looked almost magical in the morning light. Jeremiah stood in the center of his paddock, perfectly framed by snow-laden fence posts, looking for all the world like a creature from a winter fairy tale. Sarah joined Samuel in the barnyard, carrying steaming mugs of coffee and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she too had been struck by the beauty of their storm-transformed world. They stood together in comfortable silence, sipping their coffee and watching Jeremiah explore the new landscape with curious delight. "It's like everything has been made new," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying a note of wonder. Samuel nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The storm had wiped away the familiar and replaced it with something fresh and different, but underneath the transformation, everything essential remained. The buildings were still sound, the animals were still healthy, and their love for each other had not only endured the testing, but had grown stronger through the shared experience of weathering difficulty together. The work of digging out would take days, but it was work they would do together, as they had learned to do everything else. Jeremiah would help where he could, pulling small loads and providing companionship during the long hours of shoveling and clearing. And when spring came, as it always did, they would have new stories to tell and new reasons for gratitude. Spring returned to Lancaster County with the gentle persistence of hope made manifest, bringing with it the kind of renewal that seemed to touch every living thing with possibility. Samuel stood in the same spot where he had first discovered Jeremiah chained to the abandoned wagon, now nearly 2 years past, and marveled at how completely his world had been transformed by that single moment of choosing compassion over convenience. The old mill road showed no trace of the tragedy that had once unfolded here. New grass grew thick and green where the wagon had sat, and wildflowers bloomed in abundance, as if nature herself was celebrating the triumph of love over abandonment. Samuel had taken to walking this route again, not out of restlessness or searching, but out of gratitude for the path that had led him to everything that now made his life meaningful. Sarah was expecting their first child, due to arrive with the autumn harvest, and the news had filled their household with a joy so complete it seemed to spill over into everything they touched. Hannah had begun preparing the small room that would serve as a nursery, her hands busy with tiny quilts and carefully carved toys that Samuel crafted during his evening hours. Even Jeremiah seemed to sense the coming change, staying closer to the house and showing a protective alertness whenever Sarah moved through the barnyard. The community had embraced the news with the warmth reserved for events that strengthened the bonds between families and generations. Women gathered at the Yoder kitchen to share advice and stories, while men stopped by Samuel's workshop to offer congratulations and remember their own early days of fatherhood. The controversy that had once surrounded Samuel's choices seemed like ancient history now, replaced by recognition that his compassion had been the beginning of blessings that extended far beyond their own household. Dr. Matthews had become something more than a veterinarian to their family. He was now a trusted friend whose visits brought news from the wider world, and whose English perspective on their Amish life offered insights that helped them navigate the delicate balance between tradition and necessary change. During his last visit, he had examined Jeremiah with the thoroughness of someone checking on an old friend, and pronounced the donkey in perfect health, with every sign of living many more years. Samuel's carpentry business had evolved in directions he never could have anticipated. Word of his story had spread through the network of veterinarians, animal rescue organizations, and farming communities that connected rural Pennsylvania to distant places. Orders arrived from customers who specifically sought out the craftsman whose love for a suffering donkey had become a local legend. These projects allowed Samuel to support his growing family while creating work that felt meaningful and connected to the values that guided their lives. The old wooden cross that had hung above Samuel's bed throughout his childhood now graced the mantel in their front room, where it served as a daily reminder of faith passed down through generations and the importance of remaining open to God's guidance, even when it came through unexpected messengers. Sarah had added a small carved donkey beside it, a piece Samuel had created as a wedding gift to commemorate the creature who had brought them together. As Samuel stood on the mill road watching the sun set behind the familiar hills of home, he reflected on the lessons these past months had taught him about the nature of love and faithfulness. Jeremiah's loyalty had been pure and uncomplicated, driven by gratitude and trust rather than expectation or demand. The donkey had chosen to love completely, and in doing so had created space for others to discover their own capacity for devotion and sacrifice. Hannah often said that children were life's way of ensuring that love continued to grow and multiply rather than simply maintaining itself. Samuel understood now what she meant. The baby Sarah carried represented not just their own love made visible, but the expansion of everything they had learned about compassion, patience, and the rewards that came from caring for vulnerable creatures who depended on them for survival and flourishing. The evening star appeared as Samuel turned toward home, and he could see the warm light spilling from their kitchen window, where Sarah and Hannah would be preparing supper, and Jeremiah would be settling into his familiar routine of evening rest. This was his life now, built on the foundation of a single choice to show mercy to a suffering creature, expanded through love into something richer and more meaningful than he had ever dared to imagine possible.